Thank you.
Hello, hope you can hear me. I'm going to talk about VAT for the next 15 minutes. I'm going to go through the main key points concerning VAT, and the biggest one wasn't really a surprise. It was a pledge in Labour's manifesto ahead of the election, and it was confirmed on the 29th of July when draft legislation was published shortly after the victory. It's estimated that this measure will bring in 1.3 to 1.5 billion and lots of adverse publicity, I'm sure. So we'll look at that, what that means in a bit more detail later on. But moving on, it's always important to know there was no change in the VAT registration, deregistration thresholds. There was no change in the VAT rates applicable to different goods and services. There was an increase announced in tobacco duty and increased in the alcohol duty. The exception of draft products was probably to support and help the publican trade, the pub sector. And the new duty introduced on vaping products was probably to be expected. That comes in 1st of October 2026. Not sure why there's such a long delay on that. The air passenger duty rates were increased, and I'm sure the Chancellor mentioned that the increase was going to add £2 to a domestic flight. I looked at the policy paper, and it's actually the minimum increase is £7 for a domestic flight, and it goes up to 94 for long haul travel. And if you're lucky enough to be travelling first class, it would go up to £673 on top of the flight. So that's obviously only for the very rich, I would imagine. So let's go back to VAT on private school fees. With effect from terms starting 1st of January next year, all education and vocational training services provided by private schools or a connected person will be liable to VAT at 20%. They've brought in some anti-forestalling legislation, which meant that the prepayments, which were being promoted by lots of the bigger schools for their fees and board and lodging costs, anybody paying those after that announcement of the introduction of VAT on private school fees is also going to be subject to VAT. So the planning, if you were hoping to benefit from it, won't work if you paid it after that date. If you prepaid prior to the 29th of July, then you would have created a tax point, and following normal VAT rules, the tax point is the date that the tax becomes due, and you would have secured exemption for whatever fees you paid. The measures in the legislation take effect from the 30th of October, and as I said, it's in respect of terms starting 1st of January next year. There's lots of, well, perhaps we can go back a slide again. There's lots of very woolly terms used in legislation. I'm just going to cover some of those because when we get into the detail, it's quite, you may have questions, and if it doesn't apply to you, then it perhaps puts your mind at ease at the outset. The private school definition is either a school offering full-time education for pupils of compulsory school age, where fees are paid, or an institution which is wholly or mainly provides full-time education suitable for persons over compulsory school age. There are some exceptions, but we can talk about those in the next slide. So can we move it on? Who will it apply to? Will it apply to, as it says, private schools and connected parties? Connected parties will be, I think a lot of schools had been thinking about setting up a subsidiary company to run certain amounts of their activities, such as perhaps the vocational training. But it will apply to both, so the school and a connected party. And it'll also apply to certain FE colleges, such as private sixth forms and independent schools, and certain HE providers, so certain higher education providers, such as arts colleges. For some reason, they are accepted. It will not apply to FE colleges that we would normally think of, such who wholly or mainly are concerned with the provision of education suitable for 16 to 19-year-olds. It won't apply to universities. And nursery classes, provided the children are wholly or almost wholly under the compulsory school age. On that point, on the nurseries, HMRC have issued guidance more on the 30th, stating that provided particular nursery classes have more than 90%, or sorry, less than 90% of children under the school, no, more than 90% of the children under the school age, compulsory school age, they would be exempt from this measure. But obviously, if it's over, then if you've got more children over that age, then you would have to charge VAT on the fees. So that could cause problems for nurseries. And it won't apply to goods and services closely related to the supply of educational vocational training, which is quite surprising because the way that the legislation works, you have the supply of education and the things related to that follow the liability, but they're making an exception in this case. So, for example, the exemption would continue for school trips, or if the pupils have to buy materials for, I don't know, cookery lessons and art lessons and things like that. So if you're running a school, it's going to be quite a complicated mix of supplies. You're not going to be just going ahead and charging VAT on everything. One other aspect there, going back again, about school meals. So if you supply school meals, if they are separately charged for and not just included in the fees, and there's a genuine choice available to pupils as to whether or not they can bring their own lunch or whatever, or have the school meal, then the technical note that's again just been published by HMRC suggests that exemption can continue to apply for those meals where there is that choice. The practicalities, I suppose a lot of private schools already register for VAT for various activities, but those that have not been within the VAT sort of catch net before, this will be quite a complex conundrum to get your head around. Registration, the guidance says you can start registering with effect from the 30th of October 2024, but the effective date of registration, the point at which you become obliged to register for VAT, is subject to the normal rules. So you have to look at the 12 months to date, and if you have been making some taxable supplies, by the time you add on the prepayments perhaps that parents make, you might find that you have to be registered as soon as possible, even though you may not be charging VAT until January. So you need to look at the rules for when you determine your VAT registration date. With regard to the recovery of VAT, pre-registration input tax, so that's VAT on your costs you've incurred prior to the date of registration. The normal 6 months for services, 4 years for goods supply, but the goods or services must still be in use at the time of registration. So it's not everything you bought in the last 6 months or everything you bought like asset-wise in the last 4 years. And an apportionment will need to be done to reflect the earlier exempt use. If you've been using, for example, equipment in a classroom, if up until the legislation changed and the supply of education became liable to VAT, that exempt use has to be reflected in an apportionment. And post-registration is the normal rules, but schools are likely to be partly exempt. I would imagine there'll be some sort of special method agreed at some point in time, but at the moment it's standard method. So you'll have to become very familiar with partial exemption. The capital goods scheme is an aspect of VAT which was quite a complex concept. And there's been lots of speculation in the press about windfalls to private schools who've just had brand new buildings built. I don't know about windfalls, but if you've built premises, say, in the last 10 years, say a new wing built for the school, say 5 years ago, then when you look at the capital goods scheme, you would normally adjust the VAT recovery over a 10-year period. This is very very much layman's terms. But if that building was built 5 years ago, you've still got 5 intervals left after the date of registration. And that potentially brings into play 50% of the VAT that you paid on the building when you had it built. It's a little bit more complex than that, but it will have the effect of giving certain schools windfalls. But if you've either renovated, built, or expanded your school buildings prior in the last 10 years, it's certainly worth looking at now that you have to be registered for VAT. So moving on, I think I'm more or less finished. In conclusion, there's not very much in the budget if you're not in the field of education on the VAT side. If you are, it's important that you understand how and the changes will affect you. I think it will be complex, but hopefully, it'll all settle down and we won't have any more changes like this sprung upon us. Anyway, thank you very much. I'll move